Good morning, everyone. So my name, as you've just heard, is Catriona Stevens, and I'm going to be picking up where Loretta left off, as the research I'm talking about is part of Loretta's Australian Research Council-funded research project called Ageing and New Media, a new analysis of older people's care and support networks. I'm one of many researchers working with her and Professor Raylene Wilding, and in my case I'm collecting the Chinese background sample, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. I'm currently in the data collection phase for the Chinese sample as part of this project. So what I'm going to present today is an overview of the project, a description of our methodology and research tool that you saw briefly just before. I'll then move on to some general observations about the Chinese in Perth, as well as some initial findings and a couple of case studies for you. So the title of my presentation today is Chinese Older People Living in Perth, Diverse Backgrounds, Diverse Lives, Diverse Digital Capabilities. And one of the key questions I want to cover is exactly what do we mean when we talk about Chinese older people? Older people is reasonably straightforward, and I've been trying to avoid the word seniors since Jane Barrett last visited Perth and urged us to try and change the language that we use, so older people it is. Chinese, however, is a little bit more complicated, and so we need to be careful when we talk about these aggregated ethnic categories. According to the 2016 census that we just had, there are 12,995 people aged 60 and above in WA who identify as having Chinese ancestry. 13,000 people, give or take a few, who are in truth very diverse. They're from different backgrounds, speaking different languages, different ages, have different interests, different religions, different economic statuses, and different political perspectives too. So we'll keep this question in mind and we'll return to it in a moment. I'm now going to introduce in a little more detail the Australian Research Council-funded Ageing and New Media research project. So this is a 3-year project led by Chief Investigators Loretta Balthazar, who you've seen, and she's here at UWA, and Raylene Wilding, who is at La Trobe University in Melbourne. We've got a team of, I think it's 9 research assistants and research associates, all working on different aspects of the question. As Loretta has explained so clearly in her presentation, based on many years of researching transnational families, non-proximate social and emotional care can be really important for the health and well-being of people whose social network is not necessarily local and immediate. The project aims to understand, to map out the social networks of older people living in Australia, to baseline the ways in which older people are now using digital communication technologies, and to understand the current, future, and potential utility of new media for supporting and enhancing their social connections. Our research team is conducting this research among several ethno-national communities in Western Australia and in Victoria, and these are Australian-born, UK-born, Italy-born, India-born, China-born, and also Karen refugees from Myanmar. So a really diverse group of older people there, diverse groups of older people. Here is the main tool that we use in our interviews that we conduct as part of the ARC Ageing and New Media project. Loretta's already shown you this briefly, but I'll talk a bit more about it. It's really powerful because it enables the measurement and visualization of information that is essentially qualitative and also is so important for understanding the social well-being of an individual. What the tool does is it enables us to ask a person who they are in contact with, who makes up their social network, and how that contact is mediated. So the dot in the centre that you can see here, I wonder if there's a cursor, no, never mind. The dot in the centre that you can see represents the person, ego. And the first circle around it, it includes people, we ask them who do they see on a daily or weekly basis, people they're in regular contact with. And we ask them how they're in contact with them, whether it's face-to-face contact, over the telephone, using internet, various forms of new media. The second circle represents people that they're in contact with less frequently, perhaps once a month or between weekly and monthly. And the outer circle are people with whom they have less frequent contact, people that they maybe are in touch with once a year or just intermittently. The other circle that you can see sitting down on the bottom left-hand corner is often used, we can usually use that to identify people who the person is not in contact with, but with whom they would like to have some social exchange. So perhaps a cousin or a sister-in-law overseas or in another state of Australia, or metro regional for that matter. It also helps, so what this does is it helps us to find where there is potential to increase non-proximate and distant sources of social and emotional support. The tool has application beyond our research project. With a bit of adaptation, it can be used in other programs and projects to assess change in people's social connectivity over time. Wow. Okay, I'm going to speed up. Very briefly, I'm going to let you know about my research background and my involvement with the ALC project. My PhD research focuses on trade-skilled migrants who migrated to Perth during the resources boom. My methods include life history interviews, as well as spatial analysis of residential patterns and the distribution of Chinese-run businesses, so mapping the development of Chinese ethnoburbs north and south of the river. As part of my research, I also came to know many older Chinese people living in Perth. Some of these people are the parents of labour migrants that I interviewed for my PhD project, but I've also become involved in some community groups. I've volunteered with Chunghwa Community and Aged Care since October 2015, and here you can see me helping a client learn new skills in the Evergreen College computer class. I've also come to know an informal social group of Chinese grandmothers who regularly meet in a park to dance, to sing, and to share food together. Since I already had these established relationships in many communities, I was really excited to join Loretta's team to work on the China sample for the ARC Aging and New Media project. So, who exactly are we talking about when we say Chinese older people, and where do they live? Well, usually when I'm looking at the spatial distribution of populations, I prefer to use the Australian Bureau of Statistics Statistical Area 2 because it allows a more granular analysis and more equivalent units of population. But given the audience we've got here today, I thought it would be more useful to look at the data using local government areas. Looking at the map, I don't suppose it's going to surprise any of you to see that the largest populations of people identifying as having Chinese ancestry are in Canning, Melville, and Stirling, and also in Armidale. But of course, there are people with Chinese ancestry living all over the Perth metropolitan area. But I also think this category of Chinese doesn't necessarily tell us a lot about who people really are. As I expect you all know, people with Chinese ancestry can have very diverse characteristics. Birthplace is just one of them. So the 12,995 older people in Perth who identify as Chinese may have been born in Malaysia, or China, Indonesia, Singapore, sorry, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Vietnam, or indeed in Australia. Smaller numbers of Chinese were also born in Thailand, the Philippines, the UK, the US, Papua New Guinea. You get the idea. This is a really diverse bunch of people. It's also worth noting, very briefly, that country of birth is not always an accurate way of understanding an older Chinese person's personal background. Why is this? Well, you can see here that we've got 2,520 older Western Australians who were born in China. But you have to remember that China, there was a civil war from 1927 to 1949, and when the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, a great many people left to live in Hong Kong or Taiwan or another destination. So even though a person over the age of 68 may have been born in China, they may in fact have lived their lives in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and so have had a very different life and access to different, from our perspective, internet worlds and digital spaces. Let's skip ahead briefly, because I fear I'm running out of time. So there are also, so we can see big differences here. There are also other sites of difference: language, educational, occupational background, migration circumstances, how and when they came to Australia, socioeconomic status, great diversity within the aggregated group. So I think it's often worth drilling down a bit further to really understand who we're talking about living in a particular area. Okay, I'd like now to present a couple of case studies from my research with the ARC Aging and New Media project, which I think illustrate very clearly the ways in which individuals have different digital capabilities and the ways in which interventions and targeted support can help people to use technology to alleviate their loneliness and improve their social networks. Okay, Mrs. Zhang and Mrs. Xu, not their real names of course, are two people living in Perth who I've interviewed as part of this project. In many ways they're quite similar. They were both born in the early 1940s in the same province of China and continue to live in China throughout their working lives. They both came to Perth to join their children and grandchildren. But there are some key differences. Mrs. Zhang is from a middle-class family. She's well educated, worked as a medical professional in a major city and speaks excellent Mandarin. Mrs. Xu was born into a farming family, worked in services in a small county town. She doesn't really speak Mandarin, and she can read Chinese, but she can't really write it. She's not very literate, which is quite common among Chinese women of her age, and neither of them speak English, of course. They're both Perth residents at risk of being socially isolated. Mrs. Zhang lives with her husband, who's a few years older than she is. They both have limited mobility, so they don't get out the house very much. They get their shopping brought to them. Their grandchildren come to visit once a week. There's not a lot of contact there. It's pretty limited. Mrs. Xu is in good health and lives with her daughter and family, so she came over to help with the grandkids originally when they were small. So while she does see the family every day, the kids are now in school age, so she's alone in the house all day long. She's pretty lonely. What I think is interesting is the vastly different engagement these two women have with new media and digital communication technologies. Knowing what I've said about their background so far, I think the smart money would be on the highly educated Mrs. Jiang, being the digital whiz, and Mrs. Xu, semi-literate Mrs. Xu, perhaps not. In fact, Mrs. Xu told me that she used social media, specifically WeChat, every day to communicate with friends back in her hometown in China. She became quite down when her grandchildren entered full-time school, and her daughter, recognising this problem, lent her her own iPad and taught her how to use some of the apps. Mrs. Xu had thought that computing and online communication could be beyond her because of her own literacy problems. But in fact, with the advent of video chat, she found she had no difficulty at all. Anyone can press a button, she told me. She's now saving up to get her own iPad so she doesn't have to share an account with her daughter. Mrs. Jiang, meanwhile, does not use any digital communication technology at all. She has an internet connection in her home, which she uses to stream Chinese television. And she does use it a lot. She binge watches drama series all day long because she doesn't get out. She and her husband have a smartphone that their son bought them, but that sits in the drawer untouched. We've never used it once, they told me. Kind of proudly, I think. One of the key learnings that's emerging from the data collected throughout the Ageing and New Media project, and that's clearly illustrated, I think, in these two case studies, is that for older people to successfully adopt digital technologies and maintain digital communication practices, their use has to be facilitated. It's not enough to simply provide the technology, to provide the internet connection. Person-centred learning and following the interests of the older person themselves is essential if computers and tablets are to be used to improve the social networks and reduce isolation. Okay. A little bit longer than 10 minutes.
Thank you,
So, yeah, okay, sure.
Any questions? We have a few minutes for questions. Any questions for Catriona? Or reflections or comments? You reminded me, Kat, that one of the things we're looking actually for partners to support a national survey on digital literacy and digital access. As I said, it's very patchy, especially in aged care, at home and residential. So trying to deliver some policy recommendations requires us to have the evidence about what access and what literacy is like currently. So we're going to try and do that. Was there a hand up somewhere? Oh, yes, sorry.
Is that survey, is it across older Australians or is it called specific?
Across old Australians, yeah. I think that's really important. I think, as Catriona's example shows, you know, there's great diversity within groups and between. And it's an untapped resource, I think.
Just a comment that obviously in local government, our libraries often provide the best opportunity for people to learn digital skills, and particularly older people. And I suppose it's, you know, bear that in mind when, you know,
yes,
you're undertaking this research, because that's probably the largest mechanism we've got to upskill people.
You remind me, actually, I learned about, I'm not sure what the real translation would be, but the translation that was given to me was love libraries in China, which are libraries where you can go and the librarians will facilitate a Skype call with your family overseas. So you can book a time and they will help you Skype, because you might not have an internet connection in your village, in your home, but the library has one. So yeah, love libraries. I love that.
Have you, I mean, obviously from a local government perspective, your libraries would be fantastic, but also, have you seen any programs along the way, initiatives where they've used young people, so through schools or TAFEs or any initiatives?
Yes, there are a few, and there are a few people sitting in this room who are working on them, intergenerational activities, bringing schools in. I know Amana Living are doing that, and a couple of local government areas. So maybe over tea and coffee we can put you together. But, you know, classic idea, isn't it? Because the young people just seem to be born with this knowledge innate. And but it also means that there can be a re-evaluation of what it means to be old, a reconnection. In our transnational families research, we find that the younger generations are required to facilitate these connections, and that it's actually expanding support networks when in the past they were truncated by migration. So a classic example now is grandma needs grandson to set up a Skype call, her daughter needs her son to set up a Skype call. Those cousins meet over Skype because they're the facilitators. Then they're connecting on Facebook, and before you know it, they're visiting each other. So you have this expansion of a network, when in the past it was just maybe those cousins would sign their name at the end of the blue airline envelope, They didn't have any reason to be connected before. There are a few hands that went up. Can we collect those comments and questions? Kay?
Oh no, I was just going to talk about linking up with young people and
Yep.
we're the same.
Same?
Yep.
Anyone else? Yes.
Can I just make a note that the community resource centres, I come from a country town, are a great asset to people in this area. We have dedicated seniors computers and somebody who can help them. Also English as a second language, which are taught in these research centres.
There are some wonderful initiatives out there, and this is one of the problems identified in the evaluation. We don't know about them, there's no policy that governs this. So we need to hear more about them, we need to share what's working and what's not working, and that could be part of what the survey does as well. But it's great, to hear about these initiatives.
They're the old tele centres, they're now community
The
resource.
tele-centres, Telecare is a big part of the story. How are we going for time? Up? Okay. Thank you, Catriona. Thank you.